Martha Johnson had lived a simple life for as long as she could remember. She was an elderly black woman with deep wrinkles that told stories of laughter, hard work, and quiet strength. Her days were filled with stitching clothes in her small sewing shop downtown, where people came not just for her skill but also for the warmth she brought to every piece she made. The shop wasn't fancy. It didn't have neon signs or expensive machines, but it had something far more valuable: heart. One sunny afternoon, while folding a freshly stitched dress on her wooden counter, Martha heard the familiar jingle of the mail slot opening. A letter fell onto the floor near her feet. Curious, she bent down slowly, picked it up, and turned it over in her hands. It was addressed to her in neat handwriting, and the envelope felt thick, like it contained more than just a note. Carefully tearing it open, she pulled out a card printed on glossy paper. The invitation inside read, "You are cordially invited to celebrate Lily Carter's promotion at the Velvet Table." Martha paused, letting the words sink in. The Velvet Table? That name sounded unfamiliar yet intriguing. She glanced at the date, just 2 weeks away, and couldn't help but smile. Lily, her beloved granddaughter, had been working tirelessly in the city for years now, climbing the ladder in her corporate job. This dinner must be a big deal if they were going somewhere so special. Martha sat down on her worn-out chair, holding the invitation close to her chest. Memories flooded back of when Lily was little, running around her sewing shop, playing with scraps of fabric and pretending to sew alongside her. Back then, Martha would dream about what kind of life Lily might have someday. Now, here she was, a successful young woman making waves in her career. Martha felt proud, but there was also a tiny flicker of nervousness. The Velvet Table didn't sound like any restaurant she'd ever been to. In fact, she'd never even heard of it before. Over the next few days, curiosity got the better of her. She decided to ask around town about the Velvet Table. At the grocery store, she casually mentioned it to Clara, the cashier who always greeted her warmly. "Oh, you mean that place?" Clara said, her eyebrows rising slightly. "It's one of those high-end spots downtown. Celebrities go there sometimes." Martha nodded politely but didn't say much. Later, while chatting with Henry, the postman, she brought it up again. "Expensive, huh?" he remarked, shaking his head. "Not really my scene, but I guess it's nice if you got the money." Each conversation left Martha feeling more uncertain. Expensive restaurants weren't part of her world. She didn't own designer dresses or know which fork to use first. Still, she reminded herself why she was going: to support Lily. Family meant everything to Martha, and she wouldn't miss this for the world. As the day of the dinner approached, Martha began preparing herself, not just mentally but physically too. She dug out a dress she'd made years ago, a simple yet elegant navy blue number with delicate embroidery along the sleeves. It wasn't flashy, but it fit her perfectly and carried memories of evenings spent dancing with her late husband James. She paired it with a pearl necklace he'd given her on their anniversary decades ago. Standing in front of her mirror, she adjusted the hemline and smoothed out invisible wrinkles. She looked good, she thought, though maybe not glamorous by today's standards. On the evening of the dinner, Martha took extra care getting ready. She styled her silver hair into soft waves and applied a touch of lipstick, a bold red shade that matched her confident spirit. As she stood outside her modest home waiting for the taxi, she felt a mix of excitement and unease bubbling inside her. What would the restaurant look like? Would she stand out too much? These questions swirled in her mind, but she pushed them aside, reminding herself to focus on enjoying the night with Lily. When the taxi arrived, Martha climbed in carefully, clutching her purse tightly. The driver, a young man named Alex, tried to make small talk. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked cheerfully. "The Velvet Table," she replied, adding, "Do you know it?" Alex nodded enthusiastically. "Sure do. Real fancy joint. You must be celebrating something big tonight." His words made her chuckle nervously. "Something like that," she murmured, looking out the window as the city lights blurred past. The closer they got to the restaurant, the fancier the buildings became. Tall glass towers glittered under the night sky, and sleek cars lined the streets. Finally, the taxi pulled up to a grand entrance illuminated by golden spotlights. Martha stepped out cautiously, taking in the sight before her. The velvet table was housed in a stunning building with towering columns and a polished marble facade. Valets in crisp uniforms hurried to greet arriving guests, opening car doors and offering polite smiles. Martha hesitated for a moment, feeling out of place among the sea of designer outfits and sparkling jewelry. But then she straightened her shoulders, squared her jaw, and walked toward the entrance. If anyone noticed her plain dress or lack of flashy accessories, they didn't say anything, at least not to her face. One valet, a young man with curly hair, gave her a curious glance before ushering her inside. Inside, the restaurant was even more breathtaking. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like shimmering constellations, casting soft light over tables draped in pristine white cloths. Servers glided gracefully between patrons carrying trays laden with exquisite dishes. The air smelled faintly of lavender and freshly baked bread, creating an atmosphere both luxurious and inviting. Yet beneath the beauty, Martha sensed something else, an undercurrent of judgment that prickled at her skin. She spotted Lily almost immediately. Her granddaughter sat at a corner table, radiant in a sleek emerald green dress. When Lily saw Martha, her face lit up with joy. "Grandma!" she exclaimed, standing up to hug her tightly. "I'm so glad you came." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Martha replied, returning the embrace warmly. Sitting down across from Lily, she allowed herself a moment to relax. For all her earlier nerves, being with family made everything feel right again. Little did she know, the challenges of the evening were only beginning, and that by the end of the night she'd discover just how strong she truly was. As Martha settled into her seat at the velvet table, she couldn't help but feel like all eyes were on her. The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversations and the clinking of glasses, but every now and then, she caught someone glancing in her direction. It wasn't just curiosity. There was something else in those looks, something harder to define. Maybe it was surprise, or maybe it was judgment. Either way, it made her grip the edge of the table a little tighter. Lily, oblivious to the subtle tension around them, chattered happily about her promotion. "I still can't believe they gave me the lead role in this project," she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "It's such a big responsibility, but I know I can handle it." She paused, looking at Martha expectantly. "What do you think, Grandma?" Martha smiled, pushing aside her discomfort for a moment. "I think you're going to do amazing things, sweetheart, you always have." Her words seemed to satisfy Lily, who beamed before diving back into her story. But as much as Martha tried to focus on her granddaughter, she couldn't shake the, feeling that she didn't belong here. Everything about the place, the polished floors, the hushed tones, the expensive wines being poured into crystal glasses, felt worlds away from her own life. A waiter approached their table, interrupting Martha's thoughts. His name tag read Ethan, and he carried himself with an air of practiced confidence. He greeted them with a polite smile, though Martha noticed it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good evening, ladies," he said smoothly. "Can I start? You off with some drinks?" Lily ordered a glass of white wine without hesitation while Martha opted for water. Ethan nodded, jotting down their choices, but when he turned to hand them the menus, his demeanor shifted ever so slightly. Instead of placing the leather-bound book directly in front of Martha, he hesitated, almost as if unsure whether she'd know what to do with it. Finally, he set it down gently, his fingers lingering on the corner. "Here you go," he said, his tone measured. "Let me know if you have any questions." The comment struck Martha as odd. Of course she'd have questions. It was a fancy restaurant, after all. But the way Ethan said it made her feel like he doubted her ability to understand the menu. She forced a small smile and thanked him, refusing to let his attitude bother her. Still, the interaction left a sour taste in her mouth. When Ethan returned with their drinks, he lingered near Lily, chatting briefly about the specials of the day. To Martha, he barely spared a glance, instead focusing most of his attention on her granddaughter. It was subtle, but Martha noticed. She watched as Ethan described each dish in detail for Lily, using elaborate language that sounded more like poetry than food descriptions. When he finally turned to Martha, his tone changed. "And for you, ma'am," he began, speaking slower and louder, as if addressing someone who might not fully grasp what he was saying. "We have a lovely roasted chicken tonight, very simple and hearty." Martha blinked, taken aback by the shift. Simple and hearty? Was he implying she wouldn't appreciate or even understand the finer dishes? For a moment she considered calling him out, but then she decided against it. There was no point in making a scene, especially when Lily seemed so happy. Instead, she simply nodded and said, "That sounds nice, thank you." Ethan moved on to another table, leaving Martha to examine the menu on her own. As she flipped through the pages, she realized why Ethan might have assumed she'd struggle with it. The dishes were listed in French with English translations beneath them. But even those descriptions were filled with unfamiliar terms. Braised short ribs with pomace puree, pan-seared scallops with citrus beurre blanc. Martha had no idea what half of these things meant. Still, she refused to let that intimidate her. Over the years, she'd learned how to navigate situations where she felt out of her depth, and this was no different. "You okay, Grandma?" Lily asked, noticing the slight furrow in Martha's brow. "Yeah, I'm fine," Martha replied quickly, forcing a reassuring smile. "Just trying to decide what to order." Lily leaned closer, pointing to a few options on the menu. "This one's really good," she said, tapping a line with her finger. "And this one, too. Honestly, everything here is amazing." Her enthusiasm was contagious, and Martha found herself relaxing a bit. Maybe she was overthinking things. After all, this was supposed to be a celebration, not a test of her culinary knowledge. But the judgment didn't stop with Ethan. As the evening wore on, other members of the staff seemed to treat Martha differently as well. A busboy passing by their table accidentally knocked over a salt shaker, sending it rolling toward Martha's side. Without missing a beat, he apologized to Lily first, completely ignoring Martha until she reached out to stop the shaker herself. Even the hostess, who periodically checked on tables throughout the dining room, avoided making eye contact with Martha, instead offering bright smiles to the patrons seated nearby. At one point, Martha excused herself to use the restroom. Walking through the elegant hallway, she couldn't help but notice how some of the other diners stared as she passed. One woman whispered something to her companion, covering her mouth with her hand. Another man openly frowned, shaking his head, slightly as if Martha's presence disrupted the ambiance of the room. Each look, each gesture, added weight to the invisible burden Martha carried that night. When she returned to the table, Lily was deep in conversation with a server about dessert options. Martha slid quietly back into her seat, hoping to blend into the background. But blending in wasn't easy. Not when every movement she made seemed to draw unwanted attention. Even the sound of her chair scraping against the floor felt louder than it should have been. Despite everything, Martha refused to let her spirits dampen completely. She reminded herself why she was here, to celebrate Lily's success, to show her love and support. If a few snooty waiters and judgmental glances were the price she had to pay for that, then so be it. Still, she couldn't help wondering how long she'd have to endure this silent scrutiny. As the main course arrived, Martha took a deep breath and focused on enjoying the food. The roasted chicken, though described as simple, was tender and flavorful, seasoned perfectly with herbs she couldn't quite identify. For a brief moment, the delicious flavors transported her away from the tension surrounding her, allowing her to savor the experience rather than dwell on the unpleasantness. Yet, even as she ate, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of isolation. It wasn't just the staff treating her differently. It was the entire atmosphere of the restaurant, a place designed for people who looked and acted a certain way. People who weren't like her. Martha had faced prejudice before, of course, it wasn't anything new. But there was something uniquely disheartening about experiencing it in a setting meant to bring people together. Still, Martha wasn't one to give up easily. Throughout her life, she'd faced challenges far greater than this. She'd raised children during tough times, worked multiple jobs to make ends meet, and endured hardships that would break lesser spirits. This dinner might be uncomfortable, but it wasn't impossible. And as she glanced across the table at Lily, glowing with pride and happiness, Martha knew she could handle whatever came next. Little did she realize, however, that the hardest part of the evening was yet to come. As the evening progressed, the judgment Martha felt only seemed to grow heavier. The staff at the velvet table continued to treat her differently, their actions small but noticeable. It wasn't just Ethan anymore. Other servers began to mirror his behavior, almost as if they were following an unspoken rule. When Martha asked for a refill of her water glass, the server who approached hesitated before pouring, as though unsure whether she'd know how to handle fine china or crystal. Another waiter completely bypassed her when delivering breadsticks, placing them directly in front of Lily instead. Even the little things started to add up. A napkin dropped near Martha's feet, went ignored by passing staff members, leaving her to pick it up herself. When she reached for the salt shaker, a busboy quickly intercepted it, wiping it down unnecessarily before handing it back with a forced smile. Each interaction, no matter how minor, reinforced the feeling that she didn't belong here, that she was somehow less worthy than the other diners. Lily, caught up in her excitement about the promotion and the glamorous surroundings, didn't seem to notice the subtle slights aimed at her grandmother. She laughed easily with the servers, complimenting the food and asking thoughtful questions about the menu. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like the perfect evening, a young woman celebrating her success alongside her loving family. But Martha knew better. Beneath the surface of elegance and charm, there was a quiet undercurrent of exclusion, one that made her feel increasingly out of place. At one point, Martha accidentally spilled a few drops of water on the pristine white tablecloth while reaching for her glass. The sound of the spill hitting the fabric was barely audible, but it drew immediate attention from nearby staff. A manager named Stephen appeared almost instantly, his expression tight and disapproving. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his tone clipped and impatient. His eyes flickered over Martha briefly, then lingered on Lily as if assessing which of them was truly responsible for the mishap. Martha froze for a moment, taken aback by the sharpness in his voice. She hadn't done anything wrong, just a tiny spill, something that could happen to anyone. But the way Stephen reacted made her feel like she'd committed some grave offense. Still, she managed to keep her composure, nodding politely. "Yes, thank you," she said calmly. "It's just a little water." Stephen didn't respond right away. Instead, he signaled to a server to bring a fresh cloth, his movements brisk and deliberate. For a brief second, Martha thought he might say something more, perhaps apologize for rushing over so abruptly. But he didn't. Instead, he gave a curt nod and walked away, leaving behind a faint air of disapproval. Lily finally noticed the tension in the room, or at least part of it. Turning to her grandmother, she frowned slightly. "Are you okay, Grandma? You seem quiet." Martha hesitated, unsure how much to share. She didn't want to ruin the night for Lily, who had worked so hard to earn this celebration. "I'm fine," she said after a pause, forcing another reassuring smile. "Just enjoying the food." But Lily wasn't entirely convinced. As the evening wore on, she began picking up on the subtle cues, the way servers avoided making eye contact with Martha, the dismissive tones in their voices, the lingering glances from other diners. At first, she tried to brush it off, telling herself it was all in her head. But when a server accidentally bumped into Martha's chair while clearing a neighboring table, muttering a rushed apology without even looking at her, Lily's patience started to wear thin. "Excuse me," Lily called out, her voice firm but polite. The server stopped mid-step and turned back, clearly surprised to be addressed. "My grandmother is sitting right here," Lily continued, gesturing toward Martha. "Maybe next time, you could actually acknowledge her instead of pretending. She's invisible." The server flushed, stammering an apology before hurrying away. Martha reached across the table, gently touching Lily's hand. "It's all right, sweetheart," she said softly. "Don't let it bother you." But Lily shook her head, her jaw set. "No, Grandma, it's not all right. This isn't fair. They shouldn't treat you like this." Her words carried a weight that silenced both of them for a moment. Martha appreciated her granddaughter's protectiveness, but she also worried about causing a scene. She'd spent a lifetime navigating difficult situations with grace and dignity, and she didn't want to start making waves now. Not tonight, of all nights. Despite her best efforts to stay calm, Martha couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. Here she was celebrating Lily's success, yet she felt more judged and scrutinized than celebrated herself. The restaurant prided itself on exclusivity, but what did that really mean? Did it mean serving only those who fit a certain mold? Excluding people based on appearances or assumptions? Martha had always believed that true elegance came from kindness and respect, not expensive decor or fancy titles. Yet here, surrounded by wealth and privilege, she saw how easily those values could be forgotten. As dessert arrived, Martha tried to focus on the positives. The chocolate mousse in front of her looked decadent, its smooth surface dusted with cocoa powder. She took a small bite, savoring the rich flavor, and allowed herself a moment of peace. Food, at least, was something everyone could enjoy equally. No matter who you were or where you came from. Still, the tension in the air remained palpable. Even the soft music playing in the background seemed to underscore the divide between Martha and the rest of the room. Other diners laughed and chatted freely, their conversations blending seamlessly with the ambiance. Martha, however, felt like an outsider looking in, observing a world she didn't fully understand, and one that didn't seem eager to include her. Then, something unexpected happened. Across the room, a man sitting alone caught Martha's eye. He was middle-aged, with graying hair and a kind face. Unlike the other patrons, he wasn't dressed in designer clothes or dripping with jewelry. Instead, he wore a simple suit that looked well-worn but cared for. There was something familiar about him, something comforting. When their eyes met, he smiled warmly, nodding in acknowledgement. For a fleeting moment, Martha felt seen, not judged, not dismissed, but truly seen. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than she could put into words. Encouraged by the exchange, she sat up straighter, reminding herself of the strength she'd carried throughout her life. She might not fit in here, but that didn't make her any less deserving of respect. Little did Martha know, this brief connection would soon lead to something bigger, something that would change the course of her evening in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The man across the room continued to glance in Martha's direction, his expression thoughtful. After a few moments, he stood up from his table and began walking toward them. Martha watched him approach with a mix of curiosity and caution. She wasn't sure what to expect. Was he going to say something kind or just another person who wanted to judge her? When he reached their table, he smiled warmly and introduced himself. "Hi, my name is Daniel Hughes," he said, extending a hand. First to Martha and then to Lily. His voice was calm and friendly, putting both women at ease. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Martha shook his hand, returning his smile. "Not at all," she replied. "I'm Martha Johnson, and this is my granddaughter Lily Carter." Daniel nodded, taking a seat at their invitation. He explained that he'd been dining alone and couldn't help but notice the way some of the staff had treated Martha. "It's not right," he said simply. "No one should have to deal with that kind of treatment, especially in a place like this." His words surprised Martha. She hadn't expected anyone else in the restaurant to care about what was happening, or even notice. But Daniel's sincerity was undeniable. He went on to share a little about himself, explaining that he grew up poor in a small town and knew what it felt like to be overlooked or underestimated because of where you came from. "Sometimes people see your clothes or your accent and think they know everything about you," he said with a wry smile. "But life has taught me that appearances don't tell the full story." Lily listened intently, nodding along. "That's exactly how I feel," she said, glancing at Martha. "My grandma's one of the strongest, most amazing people I know. It drives me crazy when others can't see that." Daniel chuckled softly. "Well, I can see it," he said, turning back to Martha. "And I think it's wonderful that you're here tonight celebrating such a big moment with your granddaughter. You deserve to enjoy every second of it." Martha felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of validation she hadn't realized she needed. For so much of the evening she'd felt invisible, dismissed by those around her. But now, sitting across from Daniel, she felt seen in a way that mattered. His kindness reminded her that there were still good people in the world, even in places where they seemed few and far between. Their conversation flowed naturally after that. Daniel asked Martha about her sewing shop, genuinely interested in hearing about her work. He admired the dress she was wearing, complimenting its craftsmanship. "You made this yourself?" he asked, leaning closer to examine the embroidery along the sleeves. "It's beautiful. You've got real talent." Martha blushed slightly, unused to receiving such praise. "Thank you," she said softly. "I've been sewing for as long as I can remember. It's always been a passion of mine." As they talked, the atmosphere at their table shifted. The earlier tension melted away, replaced by laughter and shared stories. Even Lily seemed more relaxed, joining in as Martha recounted memories of teaching her how to sew when she was younger. "She used to sit on the floor of my shop playing with scraps of fabric," Martha said, smiling fondly. "She'd pretend to stitch them together with her fingers. I was terrible at it," Lily admitted with a laugh. "But Grandma was patient with me. She always found a way to make things fun." Daniel nodded appreciatively. "That's a gift," he said. "Patience and creativity. They're rare qualities these days." His words carried weight, and Martha found herself feeling proud, not just of her skills, but of the legacy she'd passed down to her granddaughter. Meanwhile, Ethan, the waiter who had initially treated Martha with thinly veiled condescension, overheard part of their conversation. Standing near the kitchen doorway, he paused, watching the trio interact. At first, he didn't understand why Daniel, a guest, who looked perfectly ordinary, was being so attentive to Martha. Then, as he listened more closely, something clicked. He remembered the dismissive tone he'd used earlier when speaking to her, the assumptions he'd made based on her appearance. Guilt settled heavily in his stomach. Ethan glanced around the room, noticing how other staff members continued to avoid Martha's table. Some of them whispered to each other, casting judgmental looks in her direction. It was subtle, but it was there, and Ethan realized he'd been complicit in it. Until now, he hadn't questioned their behavior. But seeing Daniel treat Martha with genuine respect made him reconsider everything. Back at the table, Martha thanked Daniel for stepping in. "It's nice to meet someone who understands," she said sincerely. "Sometimes it feels like the world isn't built for people like me." Daniel shook his head firmly. "The world needs more people like you," he countered. "People who remind us what really matters. Kindness, hard work, and staying true to yourself. Don't ever forget that." His words stayed with Martha long after he excused himself to return to his own table. As she watched him walk away, she felt a renewed sense of confidence. Maybe she didn't belong in this fancy restaurant, but that didn't mean she had to shrink herself to fit in. She could hold her head high and remind herself of her worth, even if no one else did. Lily squeezed her grandmother's hand under the table. "I'm glad we met him," she said quietly. "He seems like a good guy." "He is," Martha agreed, smiling. "And he reminded me of something important, that I don't need anyone else's approval to be proud of who I am." Their desserts arrived shortly after, but the mood at the table had changed completely. The earlier discomfort was gone, replaced by a quiet determination. Martha savored each bite of her chocolate mousse, letting the sweetness linger on her tongue. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to fully enjoy the experience, not because of the food or the setting, but because of the connection she'd made with Daniel and the reminder of her own strength. Unbeknownst to Martha, Daniel's intervention had sparked a ripple effect among the staff. Ethan approached Stephen, the manager, during a lull in service. "Can I talk to you about something?" he asked hesitantly. When Stephen nodded, Ethan lowered his voice. "Earlier, I might have treated one of our guests unfairly, the older woman at table 6. I assumed she wouldn't understand the menu, and I acted like she didn't belong here. But she does belong here. We all do." Stephen frowned, clearly caught off guard. "What brought this on?" he asked. "I saw how someone else treated her with respect," Ethan admitted, "and it made me realize I messed up. If we're supposed to provide great service, then we need to treat everyone the same, no matter what they look like or where they come from." Stephen sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He glanced over at Martha's table, where she and Lily were laughing together. For the first time that evening, he noticed the warmth and joy they brought to the room. "You're right," he said finally. "We dropped the ball tonight. Let's fix it." With that, Stephen signaled to Ethan and another server to follow him as he approached Martha's table. This time his demeanor was different, apologetic and sincere. "Ma'am," he began, addressing Martha directly, "I want to apologize for the service you've received tonight. It hasn't met our standards, and for that I'm truly sorry." Martha looked up, surprised by the unexpected gesture. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice steady. "I appreciate that." Stephen nodded, signaling to Ethan to take over. The young waiter stepped forward, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I also want to apologize," he said, meeting Martha's gaze. "I shouldn't have treated you the way I did earlier. It won't happen again." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then Martha smiled, a small, forgiving smile. "Apology accepted," she said gently. "We all make mistakes. What matters is learning from them." Ethan exhaled, visibly relieved. From that point on, the service improved dramatically. Servers checked in regularly, offering refills and clearing plates promptly. Martha noticed the change, but chose not to dwell on it. Instead, she focused on enjoying the rest of the evening with Lily, grateful for the unexpected turn of events. By the end of the night, Martha felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She hadn't let the judgment of others define her, and she'd even inspired a few people to rethink their assumptions. As she prepared to leave the restaurant, arm in arm with Lily, she reflected on the power of kindness and resilience. Sometimes, standing tall in the face of adversity wasn't just about proving something to others. It was about reminding yourself of your own worth. And that, Martha realized, was the greatest victory of all. As Martha and Lily prepared to leave the velvet table, the atmosphere around them had shifted noticeably. The earlier tension that had weighed heavily on the evening seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a sense of quiet respect from the staff. Ethan, the waiter who had initially treated Martha with condescension, now approached their table with genuine warmth. He held out 2 small boxes wrapped in satin ribbon, one for Martha and one for Lily. "I hope you don't mind," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "These are little tokens of appreciation from the restaurant. We'd like to make sure your evening ends on a positive note." Martha hesitated before accepting the gift, her fingers brushing lightly against the smooth surface of the box. She wasn't sure what to say. Part of her wanted to decline. It felt strange to receive something after everything that had happened. But another part of her recognized the gesture for what it was. An apology, however imperfect, and perhaps even a step toward redemption. "Thank you," she said finally, meeting Ethan's eyes. Her tone was calm but firm, leaving no room for doubt about how she truly felt. "I appreciate the thought." Ethan nodded, looking relieved. "You're welcome, ma'am, and thank you for being so gracious tonight. Not everyone would be." Martha didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned her attention to the box in her hands, unwrapping it carefully. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet engraved with tiny flowers, an elegant piece that seemed almost too fine for someone like her. Beside her, Lily opened her own box to reveal a matching necklace. Both women exchanged glances, surprised by the unexpected gifts. "They're beautiful," Lily murmured, holding up the necklace to admire it under the restaurant's soft lighting. "Grandma, look!" Martha smiled faintly, though her thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't help but wonder if these tokens were meant to erase the earlier mistreatment or simply smooth over the cracks. Either way, they didn't change the fact that she'd walked into this place feeling invisible and judged. Still, she chose to accept the gifts graciously, knowing that sometimes people needed a chance to do better, even if it came too late. As they made their way to the entrance, Stephen, the manager, intercepted them once more. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, his tone polite but tinged with regret. "I want to personally thank you for coming here tonight. I'm sorry if we fell short of making you feel welcome earlier. That's not who we strive to be as a team." Martha paused, studying his face for a moment. There was sincerity in his expression, but also a hint of unease, as if he feared she might lash out or demand more than just words. She considered calling him out further, reminding him that apologies weren't enough unless they led to real change. But instead she simply nodded. "Thank you for saying that," she replied evenly. "I hope tonight helps everyone remember that kindness costs nothing, and it makes all the difference." Stephen looked taken aback by her response, but he quickly recovered, offering a slight bow. "Absolutely, ma'am. Thank you for teaching us that lesson." With that, Martha stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air. The contrast between the opulent interior of the velvet table and the bustling streets beyond was striking. Here, amidst the city lights and distant hum of traffic, she felt more at ease, more herself. This was her world, where simplicity reigned, and authenticity mattered far more than appearances. Lily linked arms with her grandmother, leaning close as they waited for the valet to bring their car. "Are you okay, Grandma?" she asked softly, searching Martha's face for any sign of lingering hurt. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Martha assured her, squeezing Lily's hand affectionately. "It wasn't the easiest night, but I learned something important, and I think some of them did too." Before Lily could ask what she meant, Daniel Hughes appeared beside them. He'd been waiting near the entrance, clearly wanting to say goodbye. "Leaving already?" he asked, smiling warmly. "Yes, it's getting late," Martha replied. "But thank you again, for everything. You made a big difference tonight." Daniel shook his head modestly. "I didn't do much," he insisted. "You're the one who showed everyone here what real strength looks like, don't forget that." His words lingered in Martha's mind as she climbed into the taxi moments later. As the car pulled away from the curb, she glanced back at the restaurant one last time. Its glowing facade still looked imposing, but now it carried a different meaning for her. It wasn't just a symbol of wealth and exclusivity. It was also a reminder of the power of resilience and grace. The ride home was quiet, both women lost in their thoughts. Lily broke the silence first, turning to her grandmother with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think things will actually change for them? At the restaurant, I mean." Martha considered the question carefully. "Maybe," she said after a pause. "Some people might try harder next time, to see others for who they really are instead of jumping to conclusions. But changing hearts isn't easy. It takes time and effort," Lily added, nodding. "Like what you did tonight. You didn't let them get to you even when they tried to make you feel small." Martha chuckled softly. "Oh, they tried," she admitted. "But I've lived long enough to know that other people's opinions don't define me. What matters is how I carry myself, and whether I stay true to who I am." By the time they arrived home, Martha felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She helped Lily carry the gifts inside, setting the bracelet and necklace gently on the kitchen counter. For a while, neither of them spoke, content to simply sit together in the cozy familiarity of Martha's living room. Finally, Lily stood up, stretching slightly. "Well, I should probably head back to my apartment," she said reluctantly. "But I'm so glad we went tonight, even though it wasn't perfect." "Me too," Martha agreed, pulling her granddaughter into a tight hug. "We celebrated your success and we stood strong together. That's what matters most." After Lily left, Martha took a few moments to reflect on the evening. She picked up the bracelet again, running her fingers over the intricate design. It was beautiful, yes, but it wasn't what stayed with her. What remained etched in her memory was the way she'd risen above the judgment, refusing to let it break her spirit. She thought of Daniel's kindness, Ethan's apology, and even Stephen's belated attempt to make amends. Each moment had taught her something valuable, not just about others, but about herself. As she turned off the lights and headed to bed, Martha reminded herself of the lessons she'd learned that night. Life was full of challenges, big and small, but facing them with dignity and courage always left a lasting impact, not just on those around her, but on her own soul as well. And that, she realized, was worth far more than any fancy restaurant or expensive gift. The next morning, Martha woke up early, as she always did. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting golden patterns across the wooden floor. She brewed herself a cup of tea and sat down at her sewing machine, ready to start the day. Though the events of the previous evening still lingered in her mind, she pushed aside any lingering bitterness. There was work to be done and joy to be found in the simple pleasures of life. As the rhythmic hum of the sewing machine filled the room, Martha allowed herself to smile. She'd faced adversity before, and she knew she'd face it again. But she also knew this: no matter where she went or what others thought of her, she would always stand tall, with kindness in her heart and strength in her spirit. The days following the dinner at the velvet table passed quickly for Martha. Life returned to its usual rhythm: early mornings spent stitching clothes, afternoons chatting with neighbors, and evenings enjoying quiet moments alone or with Lily. Yet despite the return to normalcy, the memory of that night lingered in her mind like a faint echo. It wasn't just the judgment she'd faced or the apologies she'd received. It was the way the evening had reminded her of her own strength. One sunny afternoon, as Martha worked on a new dress order, there was a knock at her door. She sat beside her sewing and opened it to find Daniel Hughes standing on her porch, holding a small potted plant wrapped in burlap. "Hi, Mrs. Johnson," he said with a warm smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." Martha blinked in surprise but quickly recovered, stepping aside to invite him in. "Not at all," she replied. "Come on in, Mr. Hughes." "Please call me Daniel," he said as he entered, glancing around the cozy living room filled with fabrics, patterns, and half-finished projects. "This is quite a place you've got here." "Thank you," Martha said, gesturing for him to sit down. "Can I get you something to drink? Tea, maybe?" Daniel nodded. "Tea sounds wonderful." As Martha busied herself in the kitchen, he wandered over to inspect some of the dresses hanging neatly on a rack near the window. "You really are talented," he remarked, running his fingers lightly over the fabric of one particularly intricate design. "These are incredible." Martha returned with 2 steaming cups of tea, setting them on the coffee table before sitting across from him. "It's just something I love doing," she said modestly. "Keeps my hands busy and my mind at peace." They talked for a while, sharing stories about their lives. Daniel spoke about growing up in a rural town where opportunities were scarce, and how he'd learned early on to value hard work and resilience. Martha listened intently, nodding along as he described his journey to becoming a teacher, a profession he clearly cherished. "You know," Daniel said after a pause, "you inspired me that night at the restaurant. Seeing how you handled everything with such grace, well, it made me think about how I approach my students. Sometimes we underestimate people based on first impressions, and that's not fair." Martha smiled softly, touched by his words. "We're all guilty of making assumptions," she admitted. "But I've found that kindness goes a long way in breaking down those walls. Once people see your heart, they can't help but respect it." Their conversation flowed easily, and by the time Daniel left, Martha felt a renewed sense of connection, not just to him but to the wider world. His visit reminded her that even brief encounters could leave lasting impressions, shaping how people viewed themselves and others. Later that week, Martha decided to visit Lily at her office downtown. She hadn't seen much of her granddaughter since the dinner, and she wanted to check in on how things were going. When she arrived, Lily greeted her with a bright smile, ushering her into the sleek, modern workspace. "This place is amazing," Martha said, looking around at the glass, walls and polished desks. "You must feel so proud working here." "I do," Lily replied, beaming. "But honestly, Grandma, nothing makes me prouder than knowing I have someone like you in my corner. You showed me what real strength looks like." Martha chuckled, brushing off the compliment. "Oh, stop it, I just did what anyone would do." "No, you didn't," Lily insisted, shaking her head. Most people would have let those waiters and staff walk all over them, or worse, caused a scene. But you stayed calm and dignified. That's why I admire you so much. Her words brought tears to Martha's eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. Well, if I taught you anything, I hope it's that being kind doesn't mean letting people treat you poorly. Standing up for yourself can be done with grace, and sometimes that's the strongest thing you can do. Lily nodded, thoughtfully. That's exactly what I took away from that night, and I think some of the staff at the restaurant learned that lesson too. Did I tell you Ethan called me yesterday? He apologized again and said he's been thinking a lot about how he treated you. He wants to make sure no one else feels unwelcome. There. Martha raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Really, that's unexpected. It's a start, Lily said with a shrug. Change takes time, but at least they're trying. As they chatted, Martha noticed a framed photograph on Lily's desk. It was a picture of the two of them taken years ago, when Lily was still a child. They were standing outside Martha's sewing shop, both smiling brightly despite the faded background. Something about the image stirred a deep sense of gratitude within her. Family, she realized, was her anchor, the thing that kept her grounded through every challenge. On the drive home, Martha reflected on everything that had happened since the dinner. She thought about Daniel's unexpected friendship, Lily's unwavering support, and even the apologies from the restaurant staff. Each moment had reminded her of the importance of staying true to herself, no matter the circumstances. When she arrived back at her house, she sat down at her sewing machine. Once more. This time, however, she didn't pick up an unfinished project. Instead, she pulled out a fresh piece of fabric, a rich deep blue, and began sketching a new design. It would be a dress unlike any she'd made before, bold yet elegant, simple, yet striking. Every stitch would carry meaning, symbolizing the lessons she'd learned and the strength she'd discovered. Days turned into weeks, and soon the dress was complete. Martha stood back to admire her work, feeling a swell of pride. She knew exactly where she wanted to wear it, to Lily's next big event, whatever it might be. For now, though, she hung it carefully in her closet, ready for its moment. Life continued, as it always did, with its ups and downs, joys and challenges. But Martha approached each day with a newfound confidence. She understood now that judgment from others didn't define her. It only revealed their limitations, not hers. And while she couldn't control how people saw her, she could choose how she responded with kindness, dignity, and grace. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, Martha thought about the ripple effect of that single night at the velvet table. It had started with prejudice and ended with growth. For her, for Lily, and even for strangers like Daniel and Ethan. In a world often divided by appearances and assumptions, moments of connection and understanding mattered more than ever. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, a bird chirped softly, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. Life, Martha realized, was full of beauty, even in its imperfections. And as she sat there, peaceful and content, she whispered to herself, "Sometimes, showing them is worth every second."